Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're plunging into a fascinating, perhaps even surprising, corner of intellectual life today. When you think about the big challenges facing theology, especially, say, within the Judeo-Christian tradition, what comes to mind for you?
Well, typically people think of things like faith versus science, right?
Exactly. Or maybe clashes between different religions, internal arguments over doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Things like the Trinity or the Reformation debates about justification by faith. Those are the big historical moments.
And they were, and still are, hugely significant. They've really shaped the landscape of religious thought for centuries.
Absolutely. And, those are the kinds of debates and tensions that happen within a broadly accepted framework. The framework itself might be stretched or reinterpreted, but there's usually some common ground.
But what if the most fundamental problem theology faces right now isn't really an external attack, like from science, or even an internal disagreement, but something deeper? A philosophical question about the very nature of its language. Like, what if the core issue is whether the words used to talk about God, about ultimate reality, whether those words are actually making claims about facts, claims that could be true or false, are they cognitive claims?
Or are they doing something else entirely?
Right. Or do they function in a completely different way, something non-cognitive, maybe more like poetry or commands or, I don't know, expressing deep feelings?
That question, as the source material you've shared lays out so clearly, is precisely the central intellectual challenge theology seems to be grappling with today. It really marks a profound shift from the kinds of problems it faced historically.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that historical shift seems crucial for understanding why this cognitive versus non-cognitive question is, well, so pivotal now. As the source highlights, theology has this long history of really vigorous debate.
Oh, absolutely. Intense debate.
But those debates largely happened on shared ground, right?
Yeah.
Where the language itself was generally presumed to be making factual claims, even if they were mysterious or debated factual claims.
That's a really key point. Think back to the Old Testament prophets. Their huge struggle, their mission almost, was to convince people that Yahweh was the only true God, a singular, supreme reality actively involved in history. And they were arguing against this pervasive polytheism all around them, cultures worshiping multiple gods.
So the debate was about who was God, or what God was really like.
Exactly. But the language they used describing God's actions, God's commands, God's reality, it was fundamentally understood by everyone involved as making claims about what is, about reality.
It wasn't a question of whether the word Baal or the word Yahweh actually referred to anything real. The argument was about which one referred to the ultimate reality, or maybe if both referred to different competing realities.
Precisely. Or, fast forward to the 4th and 5th centuries, the big Christological and Trinitarian controversies.
Right, the councils, the creeds.
Think of the intense intellectual energy of figures like Athanasius or Augustine, the Cappadocian Fathers. They were wrestling with the very nature of God, the relationship of Christ to God. Was Christ fully divine? Same substance as the Father, similar substance.
Terribly complex stuff.
Hugely complex, abstract discussions. But everyone involved believed they were trying to formulate accurate, true statements about the nature of an existing transcendent reality God.
So these weren't just, like, different ways of feeling about the divine. They were genuinely conflicting assertions about metaphysical facts.
That's it. The language of the creeds, the conciliar definitions, it was intended to capture cognitive truth about God's very being. And even the Reformation in the 16th century, a massive upheaval in Western Christianity, it was primarily a debate about things like theological authority, right? Where does it lie?
Yeah.
Scripture, tradition, the church.
And how salvation works, faith, works, grace, the nature of the church itself.
Yes. But again, these were disagreements within the Christian framework, using its language to argue for different understandings of core doctrines, still operating on the assumption that the language could make truth claims.
And then closer to our time, the source mentions the 19th century and the impact of evolutionary theory. Darwin.
Yeah, that was another massive intellectual challenge. It forced theologians to grapple with new scientific findings about origins, life, humanity that seemed to contradict traditional interpretations of Scripture.
A huge clash, seemingly.
It was. But even then, for many, the project became one of, well, integration. How do we understand God's creative action through the evolutionary process? Or how do we reinterpret Scripture in light of this new scientific understanding? The challenge was often framed as how theological claims could still be true alongside scientific claims, not really questioning whether theological language could make truth claims at all.
Okay, so the historical pattern seems to be internal debates or external challenges, but generally presupposing that religious language functions cognitively. It makes claims about reality.
That's the key contrast the source is drawing. The central problem today, it argues, is different. It's not just a debate within theology or trying to integrate external findings into theology. It's a philosophical challenge, that is, and I'm quoting here, around theology and folding it entirely and calling into question its nature and status as a whole.
Wow, that sounds fundamental.
Oh, great.
A crisis about its basic right to speak about reality factually.
That's the sense you get. So for you, the listener, the mission of this deep dive, using the source you've provided as our guide, is really to get to grips with this critical challenge. We want to unpack this core philosophical problem. Is distinctively religious language cognitive, making claims about facts that can be true or false, or is it non-cognitive, functioning in some other way entirely?
In understanding this, the source suggests, is kind of a shortcut to grasping a core intellectual battle, shaping how faith is discussed in the modern world.
It really is, and to do that, we absolutely have to start by defining these terms clearly. What exactly do we mean by cognitive language here? As the source puts it, it's language used to state or assert or indicate facts or alleged facts. Its main job is to convey information. Now, that information might turn out to be accurate or inaccurate, true or false, but the point is the language is designed to make statements that are, in principle, capable of being true or false.
Okay, like everyday examples. If I say the microphone is on, I'm making a cognitive claim about the microphone's status. It's something we can check. It's either true or false.
Exactly. Or the Earth revolves around the sun. That's a cognitive claim in astronomy. We have scientific methods to verify that.
Or Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, a cognitive claim in literary history. We use historical evidence to assess it.
Right. These are all statements making assertions about reality, and we have established ways within their specific domains to determine their truth value. They function, indicatively. They point to something.
Okay, so that's cognitive. Now, contrast that with non-cognitive language. The source says this is actually really common, right? Not some obscure philosophical thing.
Oh, totally fundamental to how we communicate. Think about it. What about if I say, shut the door?
That's a command. It's not telling me a fact about the door. It's trying to get me to do something. Its success isn't about truth or falsehood, but whether I shut the door.
Precisely. Or, ouch.
An exclamation. Expresses pain, but it's not really a proposition that's true or false, just a reaction.
How do you do?
A greeting, purely social, performs a function.
Right. Or think about phrases like, hooray for our team.
Yeah.
That's expressing enthusiasm. Congratulations. Expressing good wishes. Maybe we should try this. That's a suggestion.
All doing something other than stating facts about the world. They fall outside that realm of true-false in the cognitive sense.
Exactly. They perform different jobs, and the source gives particular emphasis to one specific kind of non-cognitive language, performative utterances.
Ah, yes, J.L. Oskin's idea.
That's right. This category is fascinating. Performatives are statements where the saying of the words, in the right context by the right person, actually constitutes the action being named. The words don't describe something happening. The saying is the doing.
Like when a judge says, I sentence you to. The act of saying those words in court is the sentencing. They aren't just reporting on a sentence.
Perfect example. Or, I name this ship the Queen Mary. Said at the launch ceremony, those words do the naming.
I promise I'll be there.
By saying it, you are making the promise, not describing one you already made. I bet you 10 pounds it rains. You're placing the bet by saying it.
So these are actions done through language.
Exactly. And the source notes that while Austin later developed much more detailed categories for language functions, like exploring different illocutionary forces, like a promising, verdictive, like judging, behavitive, like congratulating, the fundamental point still holds for our question. Which is that while religious language might do many things, have many different forces, the first and most basic question we have to ask about the distinctively religious bits is it fundamentally cognitive or non-cognitive? Is it making claims that aim to be true or false, or is it primarily functioning in one of these other ways?
Now, we need to be careful here, as the source points out. We're not saying all language used in a religious context is potentially non-cognitive.
Absolutely not. Many statements made by religious people or about religious texts or history are straightforwardly cognitive.
Like if I say Islam is the second largest religion in the world, that's a cognitive claim in demography. We can check statistics.
Right. Or the Bible contains 66 books in the Protestant canon. That's a cognitive claim about the structure of a religious text, verifiable by looking at the text.
Or historical claims within religious stories, like Moses is said to have led the Israelites out of Egypt. That's a claim about history, or at least tradition, that historians can investigate using their methods if the evidence is debated.
Correct. Those are factual claims, accessible by standard methods. The real philosophical puzzle, the source argues, lies with the distinctively religious statements, the ones that often connect to historical or empirical claims, but, crucially, go beyond them, not only in what is claimed, but also in the nature of the claim that is made.
The source uses that great example comparing Jesus of Nazareth lived in the 1st century A.D. with God was at work in the life of Jesus of Nazareth.
That nails it. The first statement is historical. Historians, whether religious or not, can investigate it, and most conclude it's true based on evidence.
Okay.
But the second statement, God was at work in the life of Jesus, depends on the first being true. God couldn't work in his life if he didn't live, but it adds this entirely different layer. Someone can completely accept the historical fact of Jesus' existence, but utterly reject the claim of divine activity in his life. The second statement is making a claim of a different order.
And the problematic element, the thing that makes it different, is what the source calls the metaphysical surplus.
Exactly. It's the reference to God. It's the God talk, as the source puts it, that's at the heart of the philosophical difficulty. The source uses these analogies to drive it home. Think about, say, the prime minister was acting through the foreign secretary. We have political concepts, procedures, ways to understand and verify what that means. Compare that to God was acting through Jesus of Nazareth.
Or comparing Tom loves Mary versus God loves mankind.
Or human character is influenced by genetics versus the universe is divinely created. In each pair, the first statement is about entities or processes within the observable, natural, or human world. We have agreed upon methods, even if they're sometimes complex or debated, to investigate their truth.
But with the statements involving God.
That's where the problem lies. As the source states, there is no such agreement about how to determine the truth value of statements about God.
And it's this lack of agreed-upon criteria for verification or maybe falsification for deciding if these God statements are true or false that fuels what the source calls the inevitable suspicion.
The suspicion that maybe they don't have truth value in the cognitive sense at all. Maybe their real function lies entirely within that wide range of the non-cognitive functions of language.
And this suspicion wasn't just floating around. It got a huge boost in the early 20th century from a specific philosophical movement.
Right. Logical positivism, hugely influential in its day. And while philosophy has moved on in many ways, the debates they sparked left a lasting mark, and the source suggests they provided a crucial increment of understanding about the challenge facing religious language.
Okay, so what was the core positivist idea that's relevant here? How did they approach meaning?
Well, one of their main tools was the verification principle, or at least versions of it. Roughly, the idea was that for a statement claiming something exists, or is real, let's call it X, to have actual, factual, or indicative meaning, the existence or non-existence of X has to make some kind of appropriate experienceable difference.
Okay, so if I say there's a chair in the next room, that's meaningful because its existence makes an experienceable difference. I can go look, I can sit on it, stub my toe on it.
Exactly. Or even for something like, say, electrons. Their existence makes an experienceable difference through scientific instruments, experiments, technology that relies on them. It's detectable, even if indirectly.
But if you hypothesize something, call it Y, whose existence or non-existence makes absolutely no conceivable difference to anything anyone could ever observe or experience, directly or indirectly, now or ever.
Then the positivist would argue that the statement "why exists" isn't actually making a meaningful assertion about reality. It might look like a factual statement, but it's logically hollow. It lacks factual content.
And they applied this pretty ruthlessly, it sounds like, to God talk.
They did. The argument went something like this. If God is defined as a being who is completely transcendent, infinite, beyond space and time, and systematically unobservable, meaning God's existence or non-existence makes no verifiable or falsifiable difference within the realm of human experience or the observable world, then statements about this God, if you take them as cognitive assertions, are, by this verification as criterion, meaningless.
Meaningless in the sense of lacking factual content.
Yes, lacking indicative meaning. Therefore, the positivists concluded, if such language does have a function and people clearly use it, that function must be non-cognitive. It must be doing something else.
Okay, so this provides the philosophical setup for exploring those non-cognitive interpretations the source discusses. If religious language isn't making factual claims about a transcendent God, then what is it doing?
Exactly. And one of the earliest, most direct responses growing out of this positivist challenge was the emotive expression theory. The source links this particularly with A.J. Ayer, especially his famous book Language, Truth, and Logic. This is what the source calls vintage logical positivism.
So the emotive theory, what's the idea? When someone talks about God, they're not describing a being,
They're primarily expressing their own feelings. Ayer suggested that religious language, much like ethical or aesthetic language in his view, is used to give vent to the speaker's emotional state, and maybe, secondarily, to try and induce a similar state in his hearers.
So saying, this sunset is glorious, isn't stating a fact about the sunset, but expressing my feeling of awe, and maybe hoping you feel it too.
Just like that. So apply it to religion. If someone offers a prayer of thanksgiving, according to this theory, they're not stating a fact about God having actually done something they're grateful for. They are simply expressing a feeling, maybe euphoria, gratitude, relief.
And if they use language of penitence, God forgive me.
They're expressing feelings of, say, depression, regret, maybe self-criticism. It's about the speaker's internal state.
So a statement like God is good wouldn't be a claim about God's nature, but more like an expression of my positive feelings towards the world, or my commitment to goodness, maybe.
That's the implication. The source directly quotes Ayer, concluding that any sentence referring to a systematically unobservable entity called God is taken literally and at its face value, meaningless. It fails the empirical test, so it can't be a factual statement. Its function must be expressive or maybe persuasive, but definitely not cognitive. It's kind of like shouting, boo, or hooray.
Right.
Those utterances have a function, they express something, but they don't state facts.
That does feel, well, quite dismissive of how believers typically understand their own language.
It certainly does. And the source moves on from Ayer to what it calls a far more sophisticated and interesting non-cognitive theory, the myth and symbol approach, particularly associated with the philosopher J.H. Randall.
Okay, how does Randall's view differ from Ayer's simple emotivism?
Randall doesn't see religious language as just, crude emotional venting. He views religious symbols, myths, and language as highly developed, sophisticated forms of human expression. But crucially, he still sees them as fundamentally non-representative and non-cognitive.
Non-representative meaning they don't point to something outside themselves.
Exactly. Their power isn't in pointing to some external independent reality called God. Their power lies in what they do, in their peculiar functions within human culture, within human experience.
So if a religious symbol doesn't point to God, what does it point to, according to Randall?
Randall argued that its primary function is to point to aspects of the world which affect the human mind by evoking in it the feelings of numinous awe, cosmic dependence, and so on. So religious vocabulary becomes this special language developed over ages to express and articulate these very particular, often profound feelings that certain aspects of the world or human experience can stir in us.
It sounds like a way of deeply appreciating certain aspects of the world and then using traditional religious terms as a kind of shorthand or symbol for that appreciation and the powerful feelings it evokes.
That's very much the flavor of it. The source quotes Randall drawing a parallel with artists, musicians, poets. What do? They teach us to see unsuspected qualities in the world encountered, latent powers and possibilities there resident. They can even help reveal new qualities with which that world, in cooperation with the spirit of man, can clothe itself.
They open our eyes to new dimensions of reality in a way.
In a sense, yes. And Randall then asks, is it otherwise with the prophet and the saint? He suggests they do something similar. They help us see what he calls the religious dimension of our world, the order of splendor. They help us see the divine. They show us visions of God.
Okay, and this seems absolutely critical based on the source when Randall says divine or God. He doesn't mean a transcendent being, does he?
No, and this is vital to grasp. Randall's perspective is a form of what the source calls religious naturalism. It has a deep appreciation for the cultural power, the psychological depth, the insights that religion seems to offer. But crucially, it recognizes no element of transcendence.
No God beyond the world.
Right. When Randall uses terms like divine or God, he's using them as powerful symbols that point not to a reality existing independently of the world, but rather to aspects of the world itself and of our human response to it. He might be talking about the feeling of awe you get looking at the stars, or the sense of interconnectedness in nature, or the power of human moral ideals. He uses traditional God language as a symbol for those things, for those aspects of the world or those human responses, not for a transcendent mind who created the world or inspires those feelings.
So it's a really sophisticated psychological and cultural analysis of religion. It interprets the language as powerful human expressions about the world and our feelings, but it deliberately removes any claim that the language refers to a reality beyond the natural world itself.
That's a very good summary of it. Now, moving on, the source also discusses non-cognitive interpretations that were proposed, perhaps surprisingly, from within religious traditions, maybe as an attempt to make faith seem compatible with these modern philosophical critiques. It mentions R.B. Braithwaite, who developed a theory that essentially assimilated religious language to moral commitment.
Okay, so linking religious belief directly to ethics, to how you intend to live.
That's the core idea. Braithwaite's approach, as the source describes it, started by looking at ethical statements. He suggested that a general ethical statement, like, say, cruelty is wrong, isn't primarily stating a fact about cruelty, but rather expressing the speaker's intention, I intend not to be cruel, or perhaps, I commit to opposing cruelty.
Okay, an intention-based view of ethics, how does he apply that to religion?
Well, he proposes that a religious statement, like the central Christian claim God loves mankind, can be understood as fundamentally a disguised ethical statement. Specifically, something like love of mankind is supremely valuable.
So it's expressing a core value.
Expressing a core value, and just like the ethical statement, this is then understood as primarily expressing the speaker's intention or policy. I intend to live by the principle of love of mankind. Maybe this intention is supported by stories or parables like those in the Gospels, but the core meaning is the commitment to a way of life.
So again, God loves mankind isn't a cognitive statement about a divine being's nature or actions. It's really a declaration of a fundamental ethical value and a personal commitment to live according to that value.
That's the interpretation offered. And you can see, just like with Ayer's view, the underlying assumption here is that God talk, if taken literally as a cognitive claim about a transcendent entity, would be meaningless or unverifiable. So its real meaning and function have to be relocated in this case into the realm of ethical commitment and action. The source is actually quite critical here, suggesting Braithwaite might represent theological writers who were kind of flirting with the idea of non-cognitive Christianity without having sufficiently considered what it would entail.
That definitely implies the author thinks the entailments are pretty significant and probably negative. Which brings us, I think, to the last major non-cognitive approach the source discusses, the language game theory. This one draws on the later philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Yes, a very influential line of thought. This approach starts from Wittgenstein's later idea that the meaning of language isn't found in some abstract dictionary definition, but in how words are used within specific contexts, within specific activities. He called these contexts language games.
And a language game isn't just the words, right? It's connected to a whole way of doing things.
Exactly. It's inextricably linked to what Wittgenstein called a form of life. That's the whole set of practices, assumptions, social interactions, skills, and contexts within which a particular type of language makes sense and has its own rules.
So the language game of science has its own rules. What counts as evidence, how you conduct experiments, what valid reasoning looks like. The language game of a courtroom has totally different rules about evidence, procedure, how statements function.
Precisely. Each form of life, whether it's science, law, cooking, playing chess, making business deals, has its own kind of internal logic, its own criteria for judging the statements made within it.
Yeah.
You wouldn't judge a chess move using the rules of evidence from a law court, right? They're, in a way, autonomous realms of meaning.
Okay, I see the concept. How is this applied to religion?
Well, the idea here is that religion is another such mode of human existence, another form of life. It involves a distinctive set of practices, things like worship, prayer, rituals, reading scripture, and it also involves a distinctive realm of language using concepts like God, grace, sin, salvation, the will of God, creeds, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
From this perspective, to be religious or to have faith is simply to have a use for this realm of language. It means participating in this particular language game, understanding its terms, engaging in its practices.
Okay, that still sounds somewhat descriptive. People who are religious use certain words and do certain things. Where does the non-cognitive interpretation really bite? Is it this idea of autonomy?
Yes, that's the absolutely crucial step. The proponents of this view, sometimes called Wittgensteinian fideism, argue that the religious language game is autonomous, and this has huge implications. It means the truth or validity of statements made within the religious language game is determined internally solely by the rules, criteria, and practices of that specific game.
So the rules come from inside religion, not from outside.
Exactly. And here's the paradox, as the source points out. Because the criteria are purely internal, religious statements carry no implications outside the borders of their own realm. Meaning, if saying God is good makes sense and functions appropriately according to the internal rules of the religious language game, that's all that matters for its validity within that game. It does not mean that God exists in a way that could be confirmed or disconfirmed by looking at external facts about the world, like the existence of suffering, or by philosophical analysis of the concept of goodness or God. Religious statements on this view cannot be confirmed nor disconfirmed, supported nor challenged, by reference to what is known or believed in other spheres, like science or history or external philosophical critique.
It's like saying you can't use the rules of chemistry to criticize a poem. They're just different games.
That's the analogy. And the source mentions D.Z. Phillips as a key proponent who developed this view quite rigorously. He had a very specific take on atheism, for example.
Right. How did Phillips understand atheism from this language game perspective?
Phillips argued that the only philosophically coherent way to be an atheist is simply to acknowledge that the religious language game means nothing to one. It's the stance of someone who says, basically, I don't get it. I don't understand this game. I don't see the point of prayer or creeds or worship. I am simply at a loss to know what to make of it all. It's a position of non-comprehension or simply non-participation.
And this rules out atheism based on reasoned arguments against God's existence, like arguing it's improbable or illogical.
Absolutely. From the strict language game perspective, you cannot legitimately be an atheist because you've concluded there are no good grounds or reasons for believing in God, or that the existence of God is improbable given the state of the world, or that the concept of God is logically impossible or incoherent. Why? Because all those approaches involve trying to judge the religious language game by criteria external to it, criteria drawn from philosophy or science or empirical reasoning. And according to the theory, that's an illegitimate move. It violates the autonomy of the religious language game.
And presumably the same logic applies to arguing for God based on external reasons.
Exactly. You cannot legitimately base religious belief on such external grounds, either not on philosophical arguments for God's existence, not on probability arguments, not even on religious experience if it's understood as providing justification or evidence for belief. All those attempts try to bridge the gap between the religious game and other realms, which this theory disallows. Belief becomes something you participate in, not something you conclude based on external evidence.
So the language game view seems to offer a kind of protective bubble for religious language. It makes it immune to external criticism from science or philosophy. But the price seems to be that it cuts religion off from making any claims about the wider reality that could potentially conflict or even cohere with knowledge from other areas of life.
That is precisely the implication, and it leads us straight into the author's central critique of all these non-cognitive interpretations we've just discussed.
Okay, what's the core of the author's objection?
The author argues quite strongly that these theories, whether it's Ayer's emotivism, Randall's sophisticated symbolism, Braithwaite's moral commitment view, or the Wittgensteinian language game approach, are fundamentally not objective descriptions of how religious language has actually historically been used, especially within the mainstream Judeo-Christian tradition.
They're not just describing, they're prescribing.
Exactly. The author sees them as radically revisionary proposals for how religious language should be used now in the modern world, precisely because these theorists have first concluded, often based on positivist-style critiques about verification, that its traditional cognitive use is intellectually untenable or philosophically flawed.
It reminds me of that analogy the source uses the consultant looking at God Talk Ltd.
Yes, it's a great analogy. The consultant examines the company, decides its stated business plan, which is making cognitive claims about a transcendent reality, is unsound, probably bankrupt. So the consultant proposes that the company stop trying to do that, instead maybe become, say, a poetry publisher or an ethical guidance service or just a members club with its own internal rules. But crucially, they suggest doing this while still keeping the original company name, God Talk Ltd.
So it's a proposal for a quite new use for it, a different trade altogether, under the old familiar name.
That's the author's point exactly. These non-cognitivist philosophers, from the author's perspective, start with this negative premise. Religious language cannot mean what its users have historically intended it to mean because, for instance, it lacks empirical verification. Based on that negative conclusion, they then offer a new, non-cognitive job description for the language.
But the author absolutely insists that the historical reality, the actual usage, tells a completely different story.
A fundamentally different story. The author contends, very forcefully, that if you look at the history of Judeo-Christian faith, if you read the scriptures, the liturgies, the creeds, if you study the lives and writings of the most influential figures like the Old Testament prophets, Jesus himself, Paul, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, right down to the lived faith of countless ordinary believers today, the language used to talk about God has overwhelmingly consistently been used cognitively.
Meaning that believers genuinely intended their words to refer to a real external being, an actual God.
Absolutely. Their intention, the source stresses, was to refer to a real being who exists independently of ourselves and with whom in the activities of worship we may enter into personal relationship. They didn't think they were just, expressing their feelings or committing to ethics or playing a self-contained language game. They believed in the reality of God.
Believed in it as strongly as they believed in the physical world.
Often even more strongly. As strongly as they believed in the material world or in the existence of other people around them.
And this belief wasn't just some abstract idea. It had real-world consequences for how they lived.
Yes, profoundly so. Their conviction affected their lives as profoundly. Think about the actions people took, the ethical choices they made, the risks they ran, sometimes their willingness to suffer or even die for their faith. Think about their worship, their prayer, their moments of deep despair and profound hope. All of it, the author argues, expressed this deep-seated conviction that they were living in a world created and sustained by an actual transcendent God, and that they were in some way in relationship with this being.
So the author's point is that their words and their lives together form this consistent testimony to a cognitive understanding of their faith.
Exactly, which makes the non-cognitivist interpretations radically revisionary. They are proposing using the same words, the same language, while consciously stripping away the foundational cognitive premise that historically gave that language its primary meaning and motivation.
And the author's advice, quite simply, is not to accept the bid. Don't go along with this revisionary proposal.
Right, because, the author argues, the perceived loss would considerably outweigh the gain. While these non-cognitive theories might seem appealing, offering a way to make religious language perhaps more acceptable or less vulnerable in a secular, scientifically minded world by removing its untestable factual claims, the cost of doing so is immense.
Okay, let's dig into that. What are the specific losses, according to the source, if we adopt a non-cognitive understanding of religious language? What's at stake?
Well, the principal loss, as the source sees it, is a kind of fundamental, irreversible retreat of religious discourse. It essentially pulls back within the borders of its own autonomous language game, becoming isolated.
Isolated from what?
Isolated from making claims about reality. It must, the source says, renounce all claim to bear witness to the nature of the universe.
It stops being a statement about how things really are, in the ultimate sense.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this isolation has a major consequence. It means religious language must cease to interact with other departments of human knowledge, like science, philosophy, history, in any meaningful cognitive way. It becomes what the author calls protected discourse.
Protected how?
Protected because it doesn't need to worry about showing how its claims are compatible with, say, scientific conclusions or historical findings or philosophical arguments. Why? Because it's not making cognitive claims about the same reality that those other disciplines are investigating. It's playing its own separate game with its own internal logic, safe from any external challenge based on facts or reason.
But this safety, this protection, comes at a high price. The source says it renders traditional debates pointless.
Logically pointless, yes. Think about the kinds of debates that have gone on for centuries between religious believers and skeptics or humanists. Traditionally, believers might put forward arguments for God's existence, maybe pointing to the existence of the universe itself needing some ultimate explanation, or the reality of human moral consciousness, or profound religious experiences, or maybe even alleged miracles as evidence or reasons that support the truth of theism.
Arguments intended to persuade someone based on shared reason or common experience.
Right. But if the autonomist, non-cognitive view is correct, the source argues, all these traditional arguments become equally irrelevant to the validation of religious beliefs. They might be interesting as psychological causes that perhaps lead someone to adopt the religious form of life or start playing the language game, but they provide absolutely no logical reason or justification for the truth of the religious claims themselves, because those claims aren't actually about external reality anymore.
And the flip side must also be true. Arguments against religious belief also lose their logical force.
Exactly. Consider those really tough challenges, the ones we'll get to shortly, like the problem of evil and suffering in the world, or the sheer vastness of the cosmos making humanity seem insignificant, or the fact that science seems able to explain more and more about the world and even human experience without needing to invoke God.
Traditionally, those are powerful reasons people give for doubting or rejecting the truth of religious claims.
Absolutely. But if religion is just an autonomous language game protected in its own sphere, then these challenges, while they might be powerful psychological factors that drive people away from playing the game, have no bearing upon its logical propriety. They don't actually violate the internal rules of the game, so they can't logically invalidate it on its own terms.
So, under this non-cognitive view, religion isn't really true or false in the way we normally use those words. It just is.
That seems to be the implication. It becomes simply an established form of human life and language, just another cultural phenomenon we observe. The source uses the analogy of eating or drinking. You wouldn't really describe those activities as being true or false. They're just facts about human existence and behavior. Similarly, religion on this view is just a fact that this language game is played. And the consequence of that is that anyone is simply free to participate in it or not. The categories of objective truth or falsehood just don't apply to its core assertions anymore.
The source does acknowledge that maybe on the surface this could seem like a great relief for people trying to defend religion, for apologists.
You can see the appeal, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly you don't have to grapple with the agonizing problem of evil. You don't need to provide empirical verification for your claims. You don't need to worry about apparent conflicts with science. You can just practice your faith, use its language, and feel licensed to do so without let or hindrance from these external disciplines.
But the author immediately pivots, saying this superficial relief masks a much greater loss.
A profound loss. The source uses these very strong comparisons. There's literally all the difference in the world between fact and fiction, and another equally significant difference between fact and poetry.
Okay, so if the Christian message, for instance, is reduced to being like poetry or some other non-cognitive function,
Yeah.
what's the consequence?
Then, the source argues, its relevance shrinks dramatically. It can only hope to be relevant to those who appreciate poetry, or whatever specific non-cognitive function it's been assigned. It becomes a kind of special interest, something important only for those so minded, those who happen to choose to engage with this particular form of language or practice.
And crucially, it loses its claim to speak universally to everyone.
Yes, it loses its claim to speak to human beings as such. It's no longer something that, if it were true, would be relevant and important to absolutely everyone simply because they are human.
And related to that, it loses its claim to be news.
Exactly. The source really emphasizes this point. It goes back to the original meaning of the word gospel, the Greek euangelion. What does it mean? Good news or favorable news.
Okay.
Traditionally, the Christian message has always been presented as alleged news about a transcendent order of fact. It's presented as news that the entire universe, including human life, didn't just happen by chance, but exists by the will and for the purpose of an infinite creative mind. And furthermore, that this mind is personal in nature and has actually made itself known in some way.
And the significance lies in whether this alleged news is true.
That's the absolute crux. If this alleged news is true, the source states quite plainly, then it is obviously enormously important. Why? Because it would profoundly affect both the way in which we think about our human situation and the way in which we live our human life. It's not just a nice story or a comforting myth or a way to express feelings. It's a claim about the fundamental nature of reality and our place within it.
And this reality, if true, is what gives the distinctively Christian way of life its rational basis.
That's the author's powerful conclusion here. The specific practices, the orientation of Christian life, things like living in the world as God's world, relating to other people as children of God, with all the ethical commitments, the acts of worship, the intellectual life, the emotional responses that flow from that. All of this, the author argues, only possesses a rational character if the foundational cognitive premise, The gospel, understood as true news about a transcendent reality, is accepted as true.
So conversely, if you reject that cognitive premise,
Yeah.
if you say the news isn't actually true in a factual sense,
Then, as the source puts it rather starkly, these core activities of theistic life, the worship, the prayer, the service, offered on the basis of belief in a real, existing supreme being, become fundamentally misdirected and non-functional. They are, in a deep sense, irrational.
irrational, that's strong language.
It is. The author uses that analogy of the person acting as if they had inherited £1 million, dining lavishly, making grand plans, but who knows perfectly well they haven't inherited any money. That behavior is irrational because it's completely detached from reality as they know it. Rationality, the author argues, fundamentally involves living in terms of reality as one responsibly believes it to be.
Okay, this is a really critical point the author is making. From the perspective of traditional faith, which operates on the assumption that its core language refers to a real transcendent God, the non-cognitivist proposal, the proposal to keep using the language, keep participating in the practices, but while consciously denying or rejecting that underlying cognitive premise, is seen as deeply irrational.
Yes. You're essentially acting as if God is real for certain limited purposes, like expressing feelings or engaging in moral commitment or playing the language game, but simultaneously acknowledging or maybe even asserting that God isn't real in the straightforward factual sense that believers have historically intended.
Right. And this leads the author to present what they see as the two starkly distinct alternatives for understanding the human situation. The source insists that clarity demands we keep these two visions sharply separated.
Yes. Humanism and transcendent theism.
Let's start with the humanist vision, as the source characterizes it, particularly looking through the lens of 20th century science-oriented Western culture. How is humanity seen there?
This perspective generally views humanity as a complex and highly developed form of animal life. What distinguishes us primarily is our self-consciousness, our intelligence, our capacity for moral reasoning, and culture.
And our origin.
According to this vision, humanity is the non-purposeful product of the totality of the universe. We arose through natural evolutionary processes, ultimately stemming from, accidental collocations of atoms, with no inherent purpose or external design guiding our existence.
And what about individual human consciousness in this view?
It's seen as finite, tied to the physical brain. It runs its course for, say, 30 to 90 years, depending on lifespan, and then it is permanently broken by death. There's no personal survival, no continuation of consciousness beyond the grave.
And the source gives a pretty sobering assessment of the quality of human life viewed through this lens, doesn't it?
It does. It acknowledges that life can certainly be good, i.e. welcome, for a fortunate minority, typically those born into relatively affluent, educated circumstances in developed parts of the world, enjoying reasonable health, opportunity, security.
But for the majority.
But it has been and remains bad, i.e. unwelcome, for the very great majority of human beings throughout history and even today globally. This refers to the millions upon millions living or having lived in conditions of direst poverty and undernourishment, ill health and insecurity, burdened by relentless toil, pain, and anxiety, relieved only by occasional pleasures.
And for these vast numbers of people who have suffered throughout history, the humanist vision offers no possibility of salvation.
Not in the sense of them ever experiencing some future state, some better life that could somehow justify or redeem the hardships of their earthly existence. Because death, in this view, is absolute extinction. Their suffering, their unfulfilled potential, it's just final. It's not compensated for later.
And looking forward.
Looking ahead, the source points to deep uncertainties for the future of the human race as a whole, mentioning huge challenges like population explosion, environmental destruction, the ever-present threat of nuclear catastrophe. There's no guarantee that things will get better for the species, and indeed, they could get much, much worse.
So when you take this long view, considering the entirety of human experience, past suffering, present inequality, future uncertainty, the author concludes that the humanist vision, if it is true, is inherently profoundly tragic.
It is, and it's important to stress the source isn't making a value judgment against humanism as a philosophy or an ethical system here. It's describing the inherent tragic quality of this particular picture of reality when you contemplate the sheer scale of human suffering, the finitude of individual lives, and the ultimate cosmic insignificance it seems to imply.
And the source finds a perfect expression of this tragic vision in that famous passage by Bertrand Russell from a free man's worship.
Yes, it's incredibly powerful, almost hauntingly eloquent, isn't it? Russell talks about man being the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, just an outcome of accidental collocations of atoms.
And that stark line, no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. Individual lives just vanish.
Utterly ephemeral. And then the cosmic scale. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system.
It paints this picture of ultimate, unavoidable futility for the entire human project.
Yes. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. It's just this image of total final loss.
And therefore, Russell concludes the only honest foundation for living is
on the firm foundation of unyielding despair. It's an incredibly striking, uncompromising statement of a worldview. One that, while offering perhaps little comfort, demands a certain kind of intellectual honesty, a noble utterance, as the source calls it, and one that has deeply influenced much modern art and thought, providing that kind of background hum of cosmic indifference.
Okay, so that's the humanist vision painted in tragic colors. Over against this, the source presents the radical alternative, transcendent theism,
which the source defines not just narrowly as belief in a transcendent personal God, but including the major implications and corollaries that usually flow from that core belief, particularly in Judeo-Christian contexts.
And this offers a fundamentally different picture of humanity's place in the cosmos.
Completely different. Instead of arising accidentally, non-purposefully, transcendent theism affirms a divine purpose behind the entire natural process, the process within which the universe, life, and ultimately humanity emerged. Our existence, therefore, is seen as intended, part of some larger cosmic intention, even if we can't fully grasp the details of that intention.
What about the process of life itself, with all its difficulties and struggles? How is that viewed?
It's often seen, the source suggests, as the gradual creating of perfected finite personal life through free responses to the challenges, the opportunities the environment encountered in this world. And very importantly, this process is often believed to continue in other environments after bodily death. This life isn't the whole story.
And the nature of the divine power or mind behind this process?
In the mainstream Judeo-Christian forms, this divine mind or being is revealed or understood as wholly good, embodying perfect love, justice, wisdom. And this has massive implications for how suffering is viewed.
Right, because in stark contrast to the humanist vision, where suffering is ultimately pointless for the individual who dies.
Here, the hard travail of human life, the suffering and struggle that have marked so much of human history, are seen as neither pointless nor wasted.
Why not?
Because they occur within the context of a larger divine purpose, a purpose that is assured of ultimate fulfillment, and crucially, a purpose that cherishes the welfare of each individual human being. The individual matters, ultimately.
So this life, with all its ups and downs, its pain and joy, is seen more like
a chapter in a story which is going eventually to have a happy ending. Not just for humanity collectively, perhaps, but for individual persons who participate in that story. The source explicitly notes it's following the good news or gospel tradition here, emphasizing God's reality and love, rather than dwelling on some of the harsher historical theological traditions, like certain Augustinian strands that stress divine wrath and eternal damnation for the majority.
Okay, so we have these two profoundly different, seemingly incompatible grand narratives about human existence and the universe. The source insists we need to keep them distinct for clarity. And this brings us right back to that concept of risk we mentioned earlier.
Exactly, because transcendent theism, unlike those non-cognitive interpretations we looked at, makes a huge claim. It claims to be true. It claims its picture of reality actually corresponds to the way things ultimately are.
And because it makes this cognitive claim,
it inevitably runs the risk of being false. It cannot just retreat into a safe linguistic bubble. It has to engage with the intellectual challenges, the potential counter-evidence, the reasons people might have for doubting its truth. It must face the doubts about its truth. And the source frames these doubts, these challenges, as the four great matters of debate that a cognitive faith has to confront.
These are the big hurdles, the formidable obstacles that a faith claiming to be factually true cannot just ignore or explain away easily. What's the first of these great challenges?
The first is what the source terms explanatory superfluousness. And this isn't actually a new challenge. The source points out that even Thomas Aquinas articulated a version of it way back in the 13th century.
Really, Aquinas?
Yes. The basic idea, which Aquinas considered and then argued against, is that it's superfluous to appeal to God as an explanation for things in the world if everything can be adequately accounted for by fewer principles. Primarily, those principles would be the inherent processes of nature itself, and for human phenomena, the capacities of human reason and will. Why bring in this extra complex supernatural entity God if you don't actually need him to explain how the world works?
It sounds very much like the principle of Occam's razor: don't multiply entities beyond necessity. Keep your explanations as simple as possible.
It's exactly that principle applied to the God hypothesis, and it finds its most famous, perhaps modern expression in that story about the astronomer Laplace. When Napoleon supposedly asked him why his great work on celestial mechanics made no mention of God, Laplace is said to have replied, "Je n'avais pas besoin de cette hypothèse." I had no need of that hypothesis.
Meaning the laws of physics were sufficient to explain the motions of the planets.
Precisely. He could explain the workings of the solar system purely through natural laws like gravity, without needing to invoke divine intervention or guidance.
And the source emphasizes that this challenge is far, far more pervasive today than it was in Laplace's time.
Oh, vastly more so. It's not just astronomy anymore. It's essentially every single modern science. Physics, chemistry, biology, geology, cosmology, they all proceed methodologically without needing to invoke God as an explanatory factor within their scientific models.
Even cosmology, dealing with the origin of the universe.
Even there, cosmologists, whether they favor Big Bang models or other theories, develop incredibly sophisticated mathematical and physical models of the universe's origin and evolution that describe those processes in terms of fundamental forces, quantum fluctuations, inflation, and so on. They don't require a creator hypothesis to make the models work internally. The universe's history is explained through natural laws and initial conditions.
And this isn't just about the external physical world, right? The source says it applies to human phenomena too.
Yes, that's a crucial extension of the challenge. Psychology seeks to explain human thought, emotion, behavior through neuroscience, brain chemistry, evolutionary psychology, cognitive biases, learning, social conditioning, all without needing recourse to an immaterial soul or direct divine influence.
Even religious experiences.
Even religious experiences themselves can be studied and potentially explained by the psychology or neuroscience of religion as complex internal states arising from brain activity, cultural suggestion, or psychological needs. Sociology explains the origins and functions of religion in society through social bonding, power dynamics, cultural evolution, providing meaning systems. Even things that were once seen as clear pointers to the divine, like the existence of human conscience, the moral law within, can now be plausibly brought within the explanatory framework of human sciences, like evolutionary ethics or social psychology.
So the implication is, if transcendent theism is presented primarily, or even partly, as a cosmic explanatory hypothesis, something needed to explain why the universe exists, or why it has the features it does, or why humans are the way they are.
Then, the source argues, in light of the comprehensive success of modern science and scholarship across virtually all fields, that explanatory role for theism has become entirely gratuitous. It's not needed to fill the gaps in our understanding anymore. The gaps keep shrinking, and science finds natural explanations for more and more. This poses a profound challenge, particularly to traditional forms of natural theology, which tried to argue for God's existence based on observable features of the natural world or human reason.
So a cognitive faith, the author implies, needs to find a different way to ground itself, not primarily as a competing scientific or explanatory hypothesis.
That seems to be the implication. Now, the second great challenge discussed is described as even more severe than just being explanatorily superfluous. This is the famous problem of evil.
Right, the question of suffering.
This is perhaps the most ancient and certainly the most emotionally powerful objection to belief in an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God. It's often seen as a positive reason for not so believing.
And again, the source mentions Aquinas formulating a version of this too.
Yes, a logical formulation. Aquinas considered the argument that if one of two contrary things, like good and evil, were infinite, it would totally eliminate the other. God's goodness is traditionally considered infinite. Therefore, if such a God existed, evil should be completely eliminated. It shouldn't exist at all. But evil clearly does exist. Therefore, the argument concludes, God, understood as infinitely good and powerful, must not exist.
That's the logical structure.
Right.
And then there's the more sort of gut-level reaction captured by that quote attributed to Stendhal.
God's only excuse is that he does not exist. That biting, cynical wit gets right to the heart of the emotional challenge. How could a good and powerful God allow the sheer scale and depth of suffering we see in the world?
And the source doesn't shy away from the reality of that suffering.
No, it speaks very directly of the great ocean of human and animal suffering throughout history: disease, starvation, natural disasters, predation, accidents, the sheer brutality of nature sometimes. And on top of that, the terrifying power of demonic evil that manifests in human actions. It explicitly cites the example of the Nazi program of extermination as a paradigm case, but immediately adds that there have been all too many more recent events demonstrating horrific, seemingly gratuitous cruelty and violence on massive scales.
For many people, just confronting this reality, the Holocaust, genocides, widespread famine, children suffering, is the single biggest stumbling block to believing in a loving, all-powerful deity.
It absolutely is. The source states that for a significant number of thoughtful people, the existence and the sheer overwhelming scale of evil and suffering in the world is the overriding reason that prevents them from accepting belief in an omnipotent God of love. A cognitive faith has to grapple with this reality, not just with abstract theological arguments, but in a way that acknowledges the depth and horror of the suffering involved.
Okay, moving to the third great challenge. This one is linked more to contemporary philosophical methods, focusing on the concept of God itself. It's about the coherence of the God concept and the related problem of verifiability.
Yes, this challenge arises particularly from the practice, common in modern philosophy, of analyzing concepts themselves, asking, is the concept internally consistent? Does it hang together logically? Or does it contain contradictions? So the question is put to the traditional Judeo-Christian concept of God: is it actually coherent? Or is it perhaps, as the source suggests some philosophers argue, an assemblage of incompatible elements?
Like one of those impossible figures in perception psychology, an Escher drawing, maybe, something you can draw on paper, but which couldn't actually exist as a 3D object because the parts contradict each other.
That's a good analogy for the kind of conceptual incoherence being alleged. The source lists several classic examples of these apparent paradoxes or tensions within the traditional attributes ascribed to God.
What are some of them?
Well, for instance, God is described as absolutely perfect, self-sufficient, lacking nothing. Yet God is also said to have freely willed the creation of a universe separate from himself, and even desires the worship or relationship of finite creatures like us. How can a being who lacks nothing genuinely desire or need something outside itself, like creation or worship?
Okay, that's one tension.
Another, God is said to be infinite, utterly beyond all finite limitations and categories. Yet God is consistently described using limited personal characteristics. God knows things, wills things, speaks, acts, even feels emotions like love or anger in some traditions. How can a being that is truly infinite also possess the specific, limited characteristics associated with personhood as we understand it?
Infinite yet personal.
That does sound tricky.
Another classic one. God is described as eternal, outside of time, and immutable, unchanging. Yet the scriptures depict God acting within human history, responding to events, answering prayers, seemingly changing course sometimes. How can an immutable, timeless being interact with and affect change within the temporal changing world? And the last one mentioned, impassibility versus love.
Right. God has often been described, especially in classical theology, as impassible, meaning incapable of suffering or being affected emotionally by external events. This was seen as part of divine perfection. Yet, God is also profoundly described, especially in the Bible, as loving creatures, feeling compassion for their sorrows, sympathizing with their plight, even in Christian theology, suffering with humanity in the person of Christ. How can God be both incapable of being affected, yet genuinely love and sympathize?
These do seem like genuine, deep tensions within the traditional ways of talking about God.
They are. And for some philosophical minds, encountering these apparent contradictions leads them to conclude that there cannot possibly be any such being as the one described by traditional theology. The very concept, they argue, is logically flawed or incoherent at its core.
And the source explicitly links this problem of coherence back to the earlier challenge about verifiability or testability.
Yes, they're closely related. If the concept of God itself seems potentially incoherent, riddled with paradoxes, then it becomes even harder to answer that positivist-inspired question. What observable or experienceable difference does it make, whether statements about such as seemingly paradoxical being are true or false? How can you even begin to test or verify claims about a concept that appears internally contradictory, or whose connection to the observable world is, by definition, often indirect or non-existent? The coherence problem exacerbates the verification problem.
Okay, that's three major challenges. What's the fourth and final one the source highlights?
The fourth is the challenge posed by the conflicting truth claims of different religions. The source calls this an agonizing dilemma.
Agonizing why?
Because it arises starkly when you simply observe the diversity of sincere religious belief across the globe and throughout history. The source puts it very simply and effectively. Your likely religious identity is highly correlated with your place of birth. If you were born in India, you'd likely be Hindu. Born in Egypt, likely Muslim. Sri Lanka, Buddhist. England or Latin America, likely Christian.
Geography is destiny, religiously speaking, for most people.
Statistically, yes, for the vast majority. Yet, these major world religions each profess to be true. They make claims about ultimate reality, human nature, the path to salvation or enlightenment. Now, some traditions, like certain streams within Hinduism or Buddhism, have historically been somewhat more pluralistic or tolerant of diverse paths. But others, particularly the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, have often made fairly exclusive truth claims, suggesting their revelation or path is uniquely true or superior.
And when you look at the actual content of these different religions, their differing views on God or gods or ultimate reality,
Right.
on creation, on the afterlife, on morality, on how salvation works, it's very hard to see how they could all be true simultaneously, at least in a straightforward cognitive sense.
Exactly. It is far from evident that they can all be true, as the source puts it, especially where they make contradictory assertions. This forces a very difficult dilemma, particularly for someone deeply committed to the cognitive truth claims of their own tradition.
What are the horns of the dilemma?
Option 1. Do you conclude that your religion is, in fact, the true one, and therefore other religions, where they contradict yours, must be false or mistaken or incomplete to varying degrees?
That seems like a difficult position to hold, intellectually and perhaps morally.
It is, because, as the source points out, it seems to imply that God, if such a being exists and desires to be known by humanity, has revealed himself in a remarkably limited and ineffective way. It would mean leaving the vast majority of human beings throughout history living and dying in what, from your perspective, would have to be considered the outer darkness of illusion and idolatry, sincerely following paths that are fundamentally mistaken about the most important truths of existence. That's a tough theological pill to swallow for many people today.
Right. Okay, so that's option 1. Affirm your own truth exclusively. Relegate others to error. What's option 2?
Option 2 is to say that maybe each religion is only true subjectively for its own adherents. True for them, within their cultural context or form of life, but this implies that none of them are objectively true in the sense of making accurate claims about reality as it is independently of human belief.
And the source calls this option religious suicide.
Yes, very strong language again. But it reflects the author's core argument that this move essentially means abandoning the whole point and value of traditional religious faith, which, as we've discussed, lies precisely in its claim to declare the nature of reality and the true way of salvation or liberation. If your faith is only true for you or for your group, it stops being objective news about a transcendent reality that is universally relevant to all human beings simply because they are human. It becomes perhaps just another language game, a cultural practice, a personal preference, but it loses its claim to ultimate objective truth.
So neither choice seems particularly appealing.
As the source concludes, neither of these choices, for a person committed to a particular religious tradition, can be a happy one. It's a genuine, painful dilemma for cognitive faith in a pluralistic world.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. We've traced how theology's central intellectual problem seems to have shifted from internal doctrinal debates or integrating external knowledge to this really fundamental philosophical question about the cognitive versus non-cognitive status of its core language. This was heavily influenced by critiques like logical positivism about meaning and verification.
Right. Then we explored the main non-cognitive interpretations that arose in response in metaphysics. Ayer's emotivism, Randall's myth and symbol theory, Braithwaite's focus on moral commitment, and Wittgensteinian language game approach associated with Phillips.
And we heard the author's powerful counter-argument that these are not actually objective descriptions of how traditional Judeo-Christian faith has operated historically. Instead, they're radically revisionary proposals that come at an immense cost.
A cost that involves losing the claim to speak about reality, retreating into an isolated language game, rendering traditional debates logically pointless, and ultimately undermining the rationality of religious practice itself if the cognitive premise is abandoned.
Then we contrasted the two starkly different visions of reality presented as the main alternatives. The profoundly tragic, non-purposeful, humanist vision, eloquently captured by Russell, and the purposeful, ultimately hopeful vision of transcendent theism.
And finally, because transcendent theism does make cognitive claims about reality, it necessarily runs the risk of being false, and must therefore confront those four formidable intellectual challenges head-on.
Namely, its apparent explanatory superfluousness in the face of modern science, the agonizing problem of evil and suffering, doubts about the internal coherence of the traditional concept of God, and the related issue of verifiability, and the awkward dilemma posed by the conflicting truth claims of different world religions.
It's quite a gauntlet, and the author's core message throughout seems to be clear and quite challenging. These are profoundly difficult, complex, and challenging problems, and they absolutely should not be evaded. They must be squarely faced by any religious faith that wants to maintain intellectual credibility and claim cognitive significance in the modern world.
The implication being that a faith which claims to be true needs to show it has the resources to deal with these challenges.
Exactly. It needs to reveal within itself resources for meeting them. The author does express a degree of confidence that these problems, while perhaps never perfectly or completely dissolved to everyone's satisfaction, can be shown not to be fatal to a rational religious commitment. There's an implication that resources do exist within faith traditions to engage these challenges thoughtfully and robustly. Though, as you noted, the source itself is primarily focused on defining the central problem and laying out the challenges, rather than providing detailed solutions to them.
Right, the focus here is on understanding the intellectual landscape, the nature of the core problem, and the high stakes involved. It's really framing the current situation facing theology, particularly cognitive theology, as a kind of crucial choice point, a fork in the road.
Yes, a choice between two paths, as the author sees it.
Path one being the easy road to extinction, as they provocatively label it.
Right. That's the path of accepting one of the non-cognitive interpretations. You sidestep the really hard intellectual questions. You avoid confronting that formidable phalanx of challenges. It offers a kind of intellectual safety by withdrawing religious language from the arena where factual claims are contested.
That the price is?
The price, in the author's view, is losing the traditional meaning, the universal scope, the claim to be actual news about reality that has always characterized, say, the Christian gospel. You reduce faith to something perhaps personally meaningful but objectively insignificant, like a special interest, a cultural practice, a form of poetry. And the author clearly believes this path ultimately leads to the intellectual marginalization and perhaps eventual cultural extinction of faith as a major force making claims about the nature of reality.
Okay, so that's the easy road. What's the alternative path?
The alternative is taking the risk of facing them. That means accepting that transcendent theism does make cognitive claims about reality, and therefore willingly, consciously choosing to engage with that daunting array of challenges we just outlined. The challenge from science, the challenge from evil, the philosophical challenges of coherence and verification, the challenge of religious pluralism.
So this path involves intellectual struggle, vulnerability, acknowledging the difficulties.
Absolutely. It doesn't offer easy answers or a safe haven from critique. But, the author argues, it's the only path that preserves the potential for faith to be what it has traditionally claimed to be, a claim about ultimate reality, a source of genuine news about the universe and human existence, something that could potentially offer a rational foundation for how we understand ourselves and how we live.
And the author's own sober vote, stated not in any spirit of bravado, is clearly cast for taking that risk.
Yes. For facing the challenges head-on, grounded in the belief, or perhaps the hope, that a robust, thoughtful faith can intellectually engage with the modern world and its hardest questions, and that it must do so to remain vital and credible. It's really a powerful call for intellectual courage and honesty within faith traditions, rejecting the apparent escape route offered by non-cognitivism as being ultimately a form of self-destruction.
And that brings us to the ends of our deep dive today, into this really foundational challenge concerning the nature and status of theological language. It leaves us with a lot to think about. Given the sheer weight of these challenges that a cognitive faith must apparently grapple with, and considering the profound cost the author argues is involved in abandoning that cognitive claim, it really makes you wonder, what does it truly mean for a set of ideas to be considered true in different domains of human life, in science, versus art, versus religion? And maybe even more pressingly, how might one even begin the daunting task of evaluating which of these paths, the easy road of non-cognitivism or the risky road of cognitive engagement, offers a more compelling, more intellectually honest, and maybe even a more fully human way of trying to make sense of reality as a whole? That's definitely a question worth pondering.